We need a form. Give ourselves some room. Put those script tags at the bottom. So let's copy what they did and make a row. We saw that that was a div with a class of row. If I just type .row and use Emmet to expand it, that's what I'll get, a div with a class of row. Now, this is a grid based on 12 columns. What I want is a column in the middle that is pretty big but doesn't take up the whole thing. If you have an enormous screen and you have a paragraph that is full width and has like 4 lines in it, it is really hard when you get to a line to be able to track your eyes back to the beginning of that line. So we don't want it to be ridiculously wide. So let's say we take the middle 8 rows. The middle 8 columns out of 12. Well, first, let's just make an 8-column div. And we'll say on medium devices or larger. So that is the class medium-8. And you may remember there was also a class of columns on there. To put more than one class, just put another dot. And columns, do not put a space between. A space between means something else. So .medium8 .columns is an abbreviation that will expand to this, a div with both classes. Inside the class attribute value, different classes are separated by spaces. Inside CSS selectors, there's no space. Notice there's no dot either when you actually write the class name in the HTML. That's just the symbol that a CSS selector uses to let you know that the following thing is a class. So it's 8 columns. Let's put something in there so that we can actually see it show up. Let's just put an H2. Mega roster. Refresh the page. There it is. Let's inspect it. And you see this div. Yeah, that looks about right. 8 out of 12, 2/3. That looks like about 2/3 of the page, something like that. It's not in the middle, however, which is what we said we wanted. So we need 2 columns to the left, 2 columns to the right, right? If we want to center this, that adds up to 12. We don't have to put in another div that's too wide to the left. There's another class. We could say medium offset 2. So just offset it by 2 columns. So it's 8 wide, offset by 2, and that'll give us the middle 8. There we go, that looks centered. And you see what happened as I resized? Watch. The font size got smaller. That must be built into Foundation. And it went back all the way to the left. Now look, it's full width. That's because I just hit the small threshold. So at medium sizes and larger, it's the middle 8 columns. But at a small size, because I didn't say otherwise, it's just the whole row, which is exactly what I wanted. Because by the time your window gets ridiculously small, or if you're looking at it on a phone, we don't want, a little tiny column in the middle. The full width will look nice. Very good. So we'll make it just big enough to hit that medium breakpoint. And we need a form, don't we? So let's make a form. It does not need an action. Action is where you would put the path to the script that you want to submit the form to. We're not submitting it to another page. We're intercepting the submission and running some JavaScript. So we don't need an action at all. Now inside the form, we're going to have a single input for the name and a submit button. And I want them side by side. I would like for the input to take up 3/4 of this box and the submit button to be the rest. So even inside this div, I can create a whole nother grid with 12 more units. So I'm going to make another div. This time, you know what? I think it should be that way even on really small screens. It's not like the name field needs to be that long. It's okay if it's 3/4 of the width, even on a small screen with the submit button next to it instead of underneath it. So I'm going to use small 9 this time. Small-9. Columns. Expand that. So the one for the button, what's that going to be? Small 3. 9 plus 3 is 12. There we go. Let's put an input in this first one. Type is text. That's good. Let's give it a name. Student name. You could call it just name, but because name is also the name of that attribute, I think that's kind of confusing, so I'm going to call it student name. Instead of putting a label, we'll put a placeholder. So placeholder is just another attribute. Placeholder equals enter student name. What does that get us? This input with enter student name there, I start typing something in there and it goes away. I backspace over all that, the placeholder comes back. Now that line is getting really long, especially considering how far in it's indented. So I kind of want to wrap this onto multiple lines just for the sake of readability. Because remember, when you write this code is not the last time you're going to have to read it, especially if you actually get a job doing this kind of stuff. So save your future self some headaches and make your code readable. In this case, I do think that's just a little too long. It's not outrageous, but I'd like it better if it were wrapped onto multiple lines. So you can put line breaks in the middle of an HTML tag without consequence, assuming that you put the spaces in between your attributes. So I'm just going to put a new line here. I'm going to indent so I can tell that these are the attributes of that input. And then I'm going to line all of these attributes up with each other. Make it nice and easy to tell what's what. When we get into React especially, we're going to end up with some tags that would be really, really long if we didn't do this. Now sometimes you'll see that people then put another new line before the closing angle bracket and they line that up with the opening tag just to make it easier to tell where it ends. I think that's a little ugly, but we're going to do it that way because it's kind of common with React developers. And it does make it a little clearer. It's like lining up your curly braces. So we'll do that. So now this div is going to have the submit button, right? So let's create a button. Now we've learned several types of selectors. We've learned about class selectors, ID selectors. You can also write attribute selectors using a square bracket. So if I put square bracket type, that will make a button with a type attribute. If I put type equals submit, it'll put the value in there for us too when I expand it. Similarly, if this were the selector in a CSS rule, it would match all buttons of type submit. So this is still just regular old selector syntax. Expand it and it does that. What do I want my button to say? I'm going to say add student. I don't want to say something generic like submit. I want to actually say what it's going to do. Generally, make your button labels verbs and make them descriptive. You may notice in some crappy software, it'll pop up a dialog box that asks you some questions and then your choices are okay and cancel when those don't make any sense as an answer to the question. We don't want to be like that. We want our buttons to be clear. All right, type equals submit. Let's see how that looks. It doesn't really look like a button. It looks like the default style for a button in Foundation is to have no border, no background color. So if we throw a class on there, we can let Foundation style it for us. Let's do that. Inside the button opening tag, let's put a class of button. Looks like there's a CSS rule for that. Gives it a nice, pretty blue background. I'm also going to add another class called expanded. I don't think we're going to see much difference, but that does add a little something to it to make sure that it takes up the width of its container. Notice as we get smaller, our 8-column one cell now takes up the whole thing, and it still looks good to have these two side by side, even as we get very, very small. So that's okay. We like it like that. All right, now we have a form. That's worth a commit. Some lovely HTML. Add student form. Remember my rules for a commit message. Make it an imperative sentence that would complete the sentence, this commit will. This commit will add the student form. You could put the in there if you want to. I didn't make that rule up. GitHub itself uses that rule for their commit messages. Google uses that rule for their commit messages. I'm pretty sure Facebook does too. So it's a pretty good rule of thumb. And it makes it nice and consistent as you read through the history. You don't have to try to figure out what another person means when they write their message if everyone kind of follows the same pattern. All right, I committed that. I'm going to push it. So now it's up here, so you guys could get to it if you wanted to. Pushed less than a minute ago. My last commit was add student form.